Igtheism, or the idea that the question of the existence of God is meaningless because the word God has no coherent and unambiguous definition, is an ignorant idea. And my choice of the word ignorant here is intentional, and I mean it literally, in that igtheism lacks knowledge. In other words, as we're going to see, when igtheists apply their standard of skepticism or doubt to other domains like epistemology or ontology, they end up without knowledge of anything, or knowledge period. Now, I'll give a warning here that this is why I'm going to come down really hard on the idea of igtheism in this video. So, while I often see merit in many ideas, and in general can find at least some good agreement with others, even on topics around atheism, the problem of evil, divine hiddenness, these sorts of things, I'll admit that right off the bat, I think igtheism is just totally intellectually bankrupt right from the start. So if I don't seem as charitable as usual, this is really just a byproduct of my own inability to see much of anything worth salvaging from this particular idea, especially in light of work that's gone on in the past century. Put another way, I think there's a good reason that igtheism and many of the principles that inspired it, that we'll talk about later, are out of fashion in serious philosophical circles. So the reason I think igtheism is worth talking about, why I'm making this video, is as an example of what not to do. We can learn from both positive and negative examples, and here's a negative example to learn from. But before we get too far into the weeds on this issue, let's start by being clear and unambiguous about what igtheism, or what is also known as ignosticism, actually is. Now, I trace the idea back to the Rabbi Sherwin Wine, who was a founding figure of humanistic Judaism. Apparently, Wine first coined the term ignosticism in 1964, though I couldn't really find exactly where he did so. Now, in this picture, look, he seems like a happy guy. And one of the things to remember is that the sort of humanism Wine is championing may not be contemptuous of religion the way some secular humanists today have become. In fact, the angry atheism that has come to characterize many so-called free thinkers today was actually one of the reasons the founder of secular humanism, Paul Kurtz, and someone I believe actually knew Wine, left many of the organizations he founded, though again, the story of Kurtz is for another time. I bring this up to caution viewers from assuming humanists like Wine or Kurtz were outright hostile to organized religion the way some of today's so-called humanists are. Anyways, let's return to the topic of today's video, which is ignosticism and igtheism. What seems to have somewhat popularized the term was a New York Times article from 1965 about Wine titled "Jewish Agnostic Stirs Convention, Dropping of God in Service Deplored and Condoned." The article says, quote, "A rabbi who asserted several months ago that he did not understand the meaning of the term God has received both understanding and criticism. Rabbi Wine asserted that if religion is to be viable in the modern age, it must adapt its pursuit of the truth to the empirical method." And the article goes on, he said that if we apply this criterion to the issue of the word God, then we must ask what empirical evidence exists to establish the truth of the statement, "there is a God." He then held that if there is no empirical evidence that could possibly establish either the truth or the falsity of the statement, then the statement is meaningless. And finally, he termed himself an agnostic, explaining that an agnostic is one who says the statement "there is a God" is meaningless by empirical criteria. Now, what should be immediately ringing a lot of warning bells here is Wine's statement: if there is no empirical evidence that could possibly establish either the truth or the falsity of the statement, then the statement is meaningless. And what we see here is a very primitive form of logical positivism, one that actually cannot even meet its own standard of meaning. In fact, Wine himself seems to have been quite infatuated with logical positivism. As his Wikipedia article describes, quote, "As an undergraduate student, he was most sympathetic to empiricism, particularly its then current manifestation, logical positivism." Anyways, I've done a whole video explaining issues with logical positivism and why that project seems to have failed, so I won't rehash much of it here. In fact, I took a turn down a rabbit hole and made that video as I was preparing for this one because I knew this issue was going to come up. So check that out if you're curious. This video will still be waiting for you when you come back. Now, suppose the critiques I cite in my video against logical positivism succeed in showing that logical positivism fails. We can thus create a little argument against igtheism that goes as follows. Premise 1, if logical positivism fails, meaning it is meaningless, false, or a failure, then igtheism, which is based on it, also fails. Premise 2, logical positivism fails or failed, and our conclusion that follows is therefore igtheism fails. Now, on its own, this is actually a pretty bad argument. It sort of commits the genetic fallacy, right? Just because igtheism was inspired by or was based off of logical positivism doesn't mean it's false. So this would be a way to avoid the conclusion by challenging premise 1, saying this sort of commits the genetic fallacy. And that would be a really fair complaint, actually. I think that would be really reasonable and fair complaint. But hopefully you can see that this argument isn't completely without merit either. And the reason is because igtheism sort of invokes the verification principle, which is related to logical positivism. So let's see if we can try again. Let's see if we can do argument against igtheism 1.1. To build this argument, take a listen again to Wine's critique of the concept of God. He claims that the idea of God is meaningless for the following reason. Quote, "If there is no empirical evidence that could possibly establish either the truth or the falsity of the statement, then the statement is meaningless." And with this, we can construct a much better argument against igtheism on the basis of its criterion for meaning. And this argument would go as follows. Premise 1, if primitive verificationism is meaningless, then igtheism is meaningless. Premise 2, primitive verificationism is meaningless, and our conclusion is therefore igtheism is meaningless. Now there are two issues I want to discuss that sort of support this argument. The first is that Wine seems to not have realized or appreciated that empiricism and logical positivism are also devastating to humanism and any sort of ethical statements or claims more generally, something some of the people Wine was influenced by, like A.J. Ayer, realized. Now again, I'm not really sure how Wine addressed this. I couldn't find any of his work that explicitly explored this, whether or not he actually addressed this head on or simply brushed this under the rug, but it's worth mentioning that if any sort of talk about God is meaningless because the word God is unverifiable, then we should ask Wine, how could we in principle verify any ought-based claims like you ought not to exploit your workers or you shouldn't rape or murder? It seems to me that Wine wants to have his cake and eat it too, to keep all the ethical parts of religion without any of the binding metaphysical commitments that have served to justify or ground these ideas, at least traditionally. From what I can tell, Wine doesn't seem all that bothered by this problem, at least not the same way Kurtz was, though again that's a topic for another video. However, the real issue here is that for premise 2, we can ask Wine the following statement about meaning itself. Consider the claim, quote, a statement is only meaningful if empirical evidence can either establish its truth or falsity. Is this statement itself meaningful, the meta-statement? If it's not, or it's a tautology, then the verification principle itself fails to be meaningful. And as a result, much of the bite behind igtheism and theological non-cognitivism based on this type of reasoning seems to go away. And if the statement is meaningful, then how can we verify it without begging the question? And what could possibly count against it? And note that this is a statement about truth itself. And if you think this is a problem that's unique to Wine, think again. The following is from the entry for igtheism on Rational Wiki, which I realize is pretty poor in academic quality, but sort of helps prove my point. It reads, quote, if one offers a clear definition of an entity which is claimed to have certain properties and clear definitions of those properties, then it is one step closer to being taken seriously. However, the claim must also be testable and or falsifiable. And notice, however, that no criterion of testability or falsification are given for any of the above claims, and no clear definition is offered for what is required to take claims seriously or why we ought to accept the entry's offered standard. It goes on to say, quote, there is no evidence that anyone has a clear idea of God or how to test for its existence either. And ironically, this entry actually contradicts itself because just a few paragraphs later, it reads, quote, in those few occasions when God and his qualities are actually coherently defined, they are usually outlandish, and then ends with another statement of the verification principle. And here we of course see the fallacy of an argument from incredulity using the term outlandish, which also counts against the very argument that this article is offering because this term is offered without any clear testable or falsifiable criterion, nor clear or concise definition. We then see an assertion that one has no reliable access to God, which is asserted again without evidence or argument. It ignores decades of work in Reformed epistemology and philosophy of religion. I mean, we could go on, but hopefully you get the point here. And my point here is not to criticize the so-called Rational Wiki, but to show how this standard can be selectively applied for rhetorical effect rather than in a coherent or consistent way. I almost want to define a new term called verificationism, which is the idea that verificationism itself is meaningless because there is no non-circular and unambiguous justification for the verification principle itself. Then the ball's in the verificationist court to justify why we should accept their standard of meaning in the first place before they try and apply it to the concept of God. But to be honest, this may be unsportsmanlike conduct. While we can spend a bunch of time poking holes at verificationism, and I do think there's a point to doing this to a certain extent, in that it shows the limitations of being too stringent on meaning and truth, this doesn't really answer the question of whether the idea of God is meaningful. What the igtheist is pointing out is what they believe is an incoherence or inconsistency in the idea of God. And all things considered, I think they're asking the right question, though obviously I think they're pretty much entirely misguided in their conclusion. What really matters, what we really care about, is whether the concept of God is meaningful. And this is where we turn our attention to next. So let's ask what I would say is the right question, one I think the igtheist is perhaps getting after under all the inconsistency and selectivity. Is the concept of God meaningful? Now, before we get too much further, consider the following flowchart. If you think the idea God exists is a meaningful sentence, then you are either a theist or an atheist. In fact, theists and atheists both agree that God exists is a meaningful enough sentence to render a verdict on, they just disagree as to whether or not this sentence is true or false. I should also add agnostics here, who claim to not know whether this proposition is either true or false. Now, if you don't think this is a meaningful sentence, then you are an igtheist. Now, let's replace the sentence God exists with two others for an analogy. The first is Sherlock Holmes exists, and the second is a car that is 100% red and 100% blue exists. Now, there seems to be a difference between these two. Now, I disbelieve both exist, but there is something different about them. I may disbelieve that Sherlock Holmes exists, but I can imagine his existence in a way that I cannot do with imagining a car that is 100% red and 100% blue. There actually being a Sherlock Holmes doesn't contradict anything logically, at least not on the surface. The idea of a car that is completely red and completely blue at the same time is a different kind of thing. To some writers, like C.S. Lewis, this isn't even a thing at all. It's just a nonsense utterance of phrases. Now, whether one can reason coherently about things that do not exist, and whether there is a distinction between things that would cause a logical contradiction if they were to exist versus things that would not, is a debate around what are called non-existent objects. And for more on this debate, you can consult the friendly neighborhood Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on non-existent objects. Suffice it to say, this is a long and nuanced debate that a relatively short YouTube video is not going to exhaust. But this is all beside the point for our purposes, because to assume igtheism is true because the term God doesn't exist or refer to anything is actually begging the question in favor of atheism. And this is extra wild because the atheist usually thinks the concept of God is coherent or meaningful. They just disagree with the conclusion. And this is why I think atheism is a far more reasonable position to take than agnosticism. The atheist can at least provide arguments against the existence of God, and by doing so they implicitly assume the idea of God is something that can be reasoned about. And I think there are arguments against the existence of God, such as divine hiddenness and the problem of evil, that do have some weight. Now, do I think these are convincing logically? No. But as emotional arguments, I do understand both the motivations and conclusions, and can empathize to a large degree with them. But the ichtheist cannot reason at all about, say, divine hiddenness. Divine hiddenness is only a problem under God's existence. So if God cannot be reasoned about, then any ideas that can only follow from what the ichtheist denies as a proposition cannot be reasoned about either. Now, this may not bother the ichtheist, and more power to them, I guess. But what may bother them a bit more is whether the second order propositions, God exists is a meaningful sentence, is a meaningful sentence. This is actually why Graham Oppy thinks that igtheism is a self-defeating position. He writes, quote, "I think that it is impossible to take seriously the view that talk about gods is meaningless. Suppose you say it is meaningless to say there are gods. Is what you say meaningful? It must be that in order for, quote, it is meaningless to say there are gods, to be meaningful, there are gods is meaningful." Now, I used to side with Emerson Green on this and thought we could indeed reason about unintelligible propositions. Green has a pretty interesting article on igtheism that I'll link in the description, but after learning more about Gödel's incompleteness theorems, I found myself siding more with Oppy here. In particular, if the first order claim about the existence of God is meaningless, what is meant by reference to that term in the second order proposition? Let me take a moment and try and dumb this down a little bit. What is meant by the item X being referenced when we say something like X exists? Let's first start with our Sherlock Holmes example. When I assert that Sherlock Holmes exists, what I am asserting is that my mental idea of the character of Sherlock Holmes exists in reality that is somewhat similar to my mental picture of Sherlock Holmes. There's no problem with this reasoning. If I can reason coherently and consistently about my mental picture of Sherlock Holmes, then I can imagine that such a thing would exist in reality. But let's move on to our second example. When I say a car that is 100% blue and 100% red exists, what is the content here? How can I begin to reason about a contradiction such as a car that is 100% blue and 100% red? And this is where I think there's a clear difference between reasoning about a non-existent object that exists in a possible world and a non-existent object that exists in no possible world. What is the thing I'm mentally referencing via the words a car that is 100% blue and 100% red? What exactly am I asserting doesn't exist? In my view, it's the definition itself, not anything that has any basis in reality. We have an idea of a completely red car, and an idea of a completely blue car, but the idea of a car that is completely blue and completely red is unintelligible, and it's not something we can reason about. Let's take another example. Emerson Green states that, quote, square circles don't exist is an intelligible proposition even though square circles are unintelligible and the proposition is true. And we need to be clear about what the word square circle refers to. Now, apologies to all geometrists, but here's a definition of a square circle. A square circle is an object with 4 sides and no sides. Now, clearly this definition is inconsistent. It asserts that a thing has no sides and 4 sides at the same time. But is it intelligible? Now, I think it would be a mistake to assume this idea is intelligible simply because we can write a definition of it. A definition of something that expresses a contradiction is unintelligible. Now, the key here is this definition expresses a contradiction, which is a word we use to define as false. So again, you can say basically premise 1, if a square circle exists, then 0 equals 4. 0 does not equal 4 by the law of non-contradiction, and our conclusion is therefore a square circle does not exist by modus tollens. Again, as before, the word square circle is simply a stand-in for a contradiction and reduces to it. And our laws of thought tell us that such a definition is false. So when we say square circles don't exist, what we are really saying is contradictions do not exist, or things whose existence would imply a contradiction is true do not exist. The consequence of all of this, at least when it comes to Western Aristotelian logic, is that the statement square circles don't exist is an intelligible proposition because it expresses a tautology, which is true by definition. It is tautological because there is no idea of a square circle. So what stands in for the word square circle is the definition, which reduces to a contradiction. So the claim square circles exist is expressing something that is defined to be false by definition. There is no referent for the word square circle other than a contradiction, which again isn't really a thing, but rather a word that is defined as evaluating to false. And as a theist, I would agree that if God's existence was shown to imply a contradiction, this would imply that the proposition God exists is false. But one of the questions we should rightly ask is, why would this not simply cause us to refine or change our definition or idea of what God is? Why would we throw it out altogether? Why not say this particular idea of God is contradictory, but perhaps we can refine it to be coherent? Recall that the igtheist claims that the existence of God is meaningless because allegedly the word God has no coherent and unambiguous definition. Ironically, however, it is here that igtheism is somewhat ambiguous. Is the concept of God really incoherent, or is it just that certain concepts of God are? Why not assume it's simply our limited understanding of who and what God is that's ambiguous and incoherent? To illustrate this, what if we went ahead and applied the igtheist's logic to physics? Is the igtheist necessarily an ig-scientist? Someone who thinks it is meaningless to assert that science produces any true theories about the universe because there is no coherent and unambiguous theory of everything? What about the alleged inconsistency between general relativity and quantum mechanics, which could be way more incoherent than divine attributes, something I plan on talking about but scrap because I think that discussion is unimportant? Should the igtheist also be skeptical about scientific realism? Now, if the igtheist is fine waiting to see if future scientific work can produce a unified, coherent, and unambiguous theory of everything, perhaps they owe us an explanation for why they shouldn't be holding out to see if philosophers and theologians can converge on a coherent and unambiguous definition of God. And further, suppose God was something that could not be captured by a single definition given our finite and fallible minds. Does this necessarily mean we cannot reason at all about God or have knowledge about God in some way? And this is where I'd say many igtheists I've seen or encountered shift the burden of proof. They sit back and claim it is up to the theist to show that the idea of God is meaningful, forcing the theist to give a coherent and unambiguous definition of God. Now, it's true that if a theist wants to claim their concept of God is coherent and unambiguous, they must give such an account. But a theist attempting to do this in response to an igtheist has probably already conceded too much. It's the igtheist who first needs to justify why meaning is so stringently related to coherent and unambiguous definitions. It's the igtheist who must offer an explanation for why they have such extreme skepticism towards God if they accept, and in my experience they often do accept, all sorts of other things that don't meet the standard when it suits their purposes. More on this later. Finally, it's the igtheist who needs to offer an explanation why a being such as God would or should conform to their desired standards of meaning, as if their preferences on how reality or meaning works somehow defines reality. Actually, that latter part sounds more like an attribute of God. Consider what Thomas Aquinas says in the Summa. Quote, "To know God exists in a general and confused way is implanted in us by nature." So here is one of history's most famous and, dare I say, most accomplished theologians admitting that our everyday idea of God is indeed going to be ambiguous. Perhaps that is to be expected if we live in a world where free will and sin exist. Philosopher Brian Davies summarizes the following 3 points about Aquinas' thought. 1. We do not know what, and I'd add exactly, God is, for he cannot be defined and differs quite radically from the things we compare him to. 2. As the source of his creatures, however, God may be said to resemble them, though he lacks all creaturely limitations. And 3. There is room for arguing that certain specific predicates can be ascribed to him. In the previous example, we use the word square circle, an item constructed from two coherent ideas, that of a square and that of a circle. The problem is we tried to relate it too hard to our existing ideas of squares and circles and failed miserably. We ended up creating a contradiction and concluded that the idea of a square and a circle together was incoherent. But this was also because we constructed it in such a way to be contradictory. What if I told you refining this definition can actually help us create something non-contradictory, something that sort of looks like it has both four sides and no sides? What if I told you I could show you something like a square circle? You ready? Boom, there it is. Now, at the end of the day, whether this thing pictured has four sides or no sides or whatever is really beside the point. Perhaps this is the thing we wish to capture with the word square circle. And here's a coherent definition of a square circle, a thing that looks somewhat like a square and somewhat like a circle. Now, the atheist will probably complain that this definition is ambiguous, and fair enough, so here's a much more unambiguous definition. Regardless, why not let this be the unambiguous and coherent definition for the word square circle, rather than a shape that must have 4 sides and no sides? Now, my point in all of this is to examine the claim that the word square circle is meaningless because there is no coherent and unambiguous definition. It seems possible that we could define the word as the shape above, with a precise mathematical equation. If the ig-square circleist thinks the word square circle is meaningless, then they have the burden of proof of showing what is incoherent or contradictory about the above shape or the mathematical description. Let's put this another way. Words are used to communicate ideas. What matters most of the time in a discussion is whether the ideas themselves correspond to reality or are coherent, not the word itself or the definition per se. We can assign definitions to words however we like. And my concern is that many igtheists are playing literal word games around the definition of God. So what if some or even most people cannot articulate a clear and unambiguous definition of the word God? Why would this make any such discussion around the word God, or any of the ideas we typically attribute to God, such as omnipotence or omnibenevolence, incoherent or contradictory? Why would this observation not instead push us to study theology, so we could be more clear and less ambiguous about the term God? And remember, it's the igtheist who has the burden of proof. They are the ones claiming no coherent and unambiguous definition of God has been given, which is logically equivalent to saying every single definition of God that has been given is incoherent or ambiguous, or every single definition of God that could be given is incoherent or ambiguous. So all the theist needs to do is find a single definition of God that is coherent, which we will attempt to do for in a minute, that satisfies the igtheist's desire for disambiguation. And actually, to avoid the igtheist from playing any games, perhaps the theist should first ask to the igtheist for an unambiguous and coherent definition of ambiguity. Otherwise, igtheism itself is a meaningless utterance by the igtheist's own standard. And this is a great segue into talking about knowledge, and as we'll soon see, ignorance, or the lack of knowledge. Let's take a detour for a moment and talk about epistemology, or the study of knowledge. One of the biggest questions epistemology asks is what the difference between knowledge and mere belief is. So when it comes to the question of whether we have knowledge, philosophers have argued about many fundamental things about what knowledge is and how we get it. These include whether knowledge is just justified true belief, what is often called the JTB condition, or whether there is something more. And Edmund Gettier famously blew this question over with his 1963 paper titled Is Justified True Belief Knowledge? Though I should also mention the Indian philosopher Dattmotara asked basically the same question in 770 AD, so almost 1,000 years before Gettier. Other questions about the definition of knowledge include whether justification depends on something inside our minds or something in the external world, what is sometimes called externalism versus internalism, and as you can see, even professional philosophers are quite divided on this issue. Finally, there are serious and debated questions about whether knowledge has additional factors such as warrant. All of this to say is there is no coherent and agreed upon definitions of what knowledge means. Should we then be skeptical about knowledge or doubt that we know anything at all? Now, the word ignorant literally means without knowledge or lacking knowledge. So let me define a new term in light of what we just discussed, which is called epistemology. Epistemology says the question of whether I have any knowledge is meaningless because the word knowledge has no coherent and unambiguous definition. And the question we want to ask is whether igtheists are also epistemologists. If so, then they think the question of whether they know anything is meaningless, so perhaps we shouldn't take them all that seriously, including whether they know anything about language or definitions or meaning itself. And if igtheists are not epistemologists, then clearly coherent and unambiguous definitions aren't really the problem for them. This means they probably have some other problem about the word God, and seems to be simply using atheism as an excuse or a cover for some other issue. Now, what those other issues could be are the topic for another video, and this is where atheism starts to look like a pretty ridiculous position. And this is why I also appreciate many atheists who call it out as such. This example of knowledge is a good analogy because it shows that although we don't have a coherent and unambiguous definition of knowledge, we don't all even agree on what knowledge is, we can still get a general enough idea that is often good enough for many purposes. Personally, I don't think people need to be expert epistemologists to be able to say they have knowledge. If I ask them to define knowledge, they may give a definition that is ambiguous or perhaps even contradictory. But is this a good reason to think there isn't a possible definition of knowledge that is coherent or uncontradictory? Is this a good reason to think that the question of whether we have knowledge at all is meaningless? I don't think so. Now, there is a good point in what the igtheist is saying, and let me try and draw this out for a second. It is important to be clear when we're using language. When two people have a conversation, they are using words to try and communicate mental ideas. And what is meant by a given word may not invoke the same mental idea. So I understand the complaint that when talking with different people about what they mean by the word God, the mental idea that is brought up may be different. This is why analytic philosophers tend to be so anal about definitions. They want to be clear about language and meaning so the idea communicated is represented as accurately and similarly as possible. But the issue here is the igtheist hasn't offered any reason why the word God is any more problematic other than any other word, besides of course the primitive verification principle you hopefully have realized is misguided. For pretty much all words, meaning depends on context. And personally, I don't think there are mind or stance independent definitions of words, right? There's no magical dictionary in the sky we can use to test whether a given definition is true or not. And my argument from this actually comes from J.L. Mackie, inspired by his famous argument from queerness. And here's my version as the kind of argument from queerness against definitions, right? If there were objective definitions, they would be things of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. So personally, I think the igtheist has failed to give us a reason to think the ambiguity around the word God is any different from the ambiguity or potential incoherence around the word knowledge or truth or anything else for that matter. So they can either give up their issue around the word God, or they could admit their skepticism also applies to knowledge and truth, which of course undermines their skepticism. In this way, skepticism can be a double-edged sword because it can end up undermining itself. But unfortunately, it gets worse. Often what is accompanied by igtheists' arguments about meaning is an appeal to consensus, which is of course a logical fallacy. Now, I think sometimes being too nitpicky about fallacies can end up being distracting from the actual point, but I want to call this out because to me it looks like there's a bit of a sleight of hand here to try and link consensus to epistemology, which I think is really misguided. So let's go back to Rational Wiki and notice how the entry states, quote, "Experience shows that theists often propose God exists, yet rarely offer a clear definition of God." And it goes ahead and continues, quote, "In those few occasions when God and his qualities are actually coherently defined, they are usually outlandish." Now, suppose we grant, for the sake of argument, that theists do rarely offer a clear and coherent definition of God. Would this show that attempts to clarify the definition of God are therefore meaningless? No. Suppose the igtheists did their due diligence and asked every single person on earth what their definition of God was, and found that none of these definitions offered were coherent. Does it follow that no definition can be offered that is coherent? No. It would be a total non sequitur to argue this way. And yet this kind of fallacious reasoning is implicit here on this entry on igtheism. To make a parallel to epistemology, would the fact that most people cannot give a coherent and non-outlandish definition of knowledge mean that people making claims to knowledge is meaningless? Well, perhaps the igtheist thinks so. Here's their argument offered in favor of knowledge. Experience shows people often propose knowledge exists, yet rarely offer a clear definition of knowledge. In those few instances where knowledge and its properties are actually defined, they are usually outlandish, proposing non-falsifiable concepts like warrant or internalism. Not to beat a dead horse, but my advice is to be very skeptical around words like rarely or few, especially because no arguments have been offered in favor of why we should say rarely as opposed to sometimes or even usually. Furthermore, to claim God's qualities are outlandish without further elaboration is kind of odd to me. Outlandish with respect to what? I ask this question because there are arguments that not having any restrictions on ideas like knowledge or power when it comes to God is actually more reasonable to suppose than arbitrary restrictions, and you can read Swinburne for more on this. Lastly, let's go ahead and take the objection the igtheist has head on. What exactly is incoherent about the definition of God? Now, let me propose the following definition of God. The word God refers to the uncaused first cause, the creator and ruler of the universe. Now, what is incoherent and ambiguous about this definition? Now, I'm hoping an actual igtheist will help me here because I'm having difficulty seeing anything contradictory about this definition. Now, I can try and anticipate where an igtheist could have issues. Now, the idea of an uncaused first cause goes all the way back 2,500 years to Aristotle. You can read Thomas Aquinas for more on this. But I have difficulty seeing what is incoherent or contradictory about claiming the causal chain has a first link, and we simply use the word God to refer to the idea of the first link in this chain. Note again, you don't need to believe that the causal chain actually needs or has a first link. Rather, you simply need to believe the idea of the causal chain having a first link isn't an explicit contradiction or isn't contradicted by other parts of the definition. To me, this first part seems totally coherent. What about the second part, the universe having a creator or ruler? Well, if the universe is created, then its cause is attributable to God one way or another. In fact, we have evidence that the universe was, in fact, created. Consider what astronomer Alan Sandage said, who determined the first reasonably accurate values for the Hubble constant and the age of the universe. He says, quote, "What has happened in the last 50 years is a remarkable event within astronomy and astrophysics. By looking up at the sky, some astronomers have come to the belief that there is evidence for a creation event," end quote. Evidence for a creation event actually led Sandage to belief in God, and he eventually became a Christian. So if we accept ideas from mainstream cosmology, such as there having been a Big Bang, then the idea that there was a Big Banger, in the words of Greg Koukl, doesn't seem all that incoherent either. And what about the ruler part? Well, anyone who accepts the idea of scientific laws can understand that laws, in pretty much all cases, have a lawmaker who prescribes them. In fact, the whole reason we have the word scientific law is thanks to theism and its history in the Western Academy. Again, the question isn't whether or not it's logically possible that nature could exist or behave regularly on its own. Rather, it's whether the idea that the universe has a legislator is inherently contradictory. It seems pretty clear to me that the igtheist must be assuming some additional hidden premises because I don't see anything contradictory or incoherent about this definition. Now, perhaps the igtheist grants this definition is coherent, but thinks it's ambiguous. What then? Well, first, the igtheist needs to be unambiguous about what ambiguity actually is. Again, remember, they are the ones claiming that things without a coherent or precise definitions are meaningless. So let's be consistent and hold them to their own standard. Without such a definition, it's hard to see whether the above definition of God is problematic or not. Additionally, I'd point out that ambiguity is a kind of relative thing. What may be considered unambiguous in one context is actually ambiguous in another. Here's an example. When an engineer gets a product brief, the same brief may be unambiguous for the marketing team to do background market research, but ambiguous for how the engineer should go about designing the product. Is the brief ambiguous or unambiguous? Well, it depends on what the goal of the document is and who's reading it. Perhaps the document is unambiguous even to the engineer, because they understand the purpose of the document is not to tell them how to design the product, but instead tell them the features they need to incorporate when they build it. Similarly, while this definition of God may be ambiguous to analytic philosophers who want the word God to capture additional notions such as omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence, it may be unambiguous enough for many Christians who are unconcerned or uninterested in this kind of precision. And to be honest, it's hard for me to fault them for this. After all, their reason for believing in God is probably not based on a deductive argument like this. Rather, perhaps it is implicitly based on other epistemic notions, such as those talked about by Quine or C.S. Lewis. So in the end, my claim is that igtheism is ignorant because it implies skepticism about knowledge itself for the reasons discussed in this video. And as I mentioned at the start, I'm using the term ignorance quite literally here. But to many others, igtheism is also ignorant in the more general usage of the term too, in the sense that it appears to rely on an unsophisticated and primitive form of the verification principle, and can appear blissfully unaware of how it fails its own standard due to ambiguity around the word meaning and the word ambiguity itself. But then again, perhaps we should ask a more fundamental question. Is it reasonable to suggest that a quick, single definition by fallible humans can capture everything there is to know about the creator and ruler of the universe? With that said, let me try to end on a positive note. The igtheist has actually given us a reason to study theology and philosophy of religion more broadly. They are correct to suggest that whatever can be invoked by the word God can be different ideas for different people, though of course this is true for any word. However, rather than giving up and simply ending the conversation, why not use this as a starting point for deeper conversation? Why not think the process of discussion and debate is a springboard for further synthesis? Perhaps this is why, and I think it was N.T. Wright who, when someone would come up to him and say, "I don't believe in God," he would respond by saying, "Tell me about the God you don't believe in. Chances are I don't believe in him either." Anyways, I'll leave it at that. Here are the references, and these are also in the comments. So I'll see you in the next video, and thanks for watching.